Here goes.
Come on back, everybody. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
And welcome to the Miqra.
Good.
If you weren't here when I said that at the beginning, welcome.
Thank you.
We're going to get into a study of a passage of Scripture that's very familiar. I think the hardest one to teach or to preach on is the one that is most familiar. And so bear with me as I walk through this passage of teaching. The title of the teaching today is The Greatest of These. And of course we're talking about love. 1 Corinthians chapter 13. I'm going to just begin by reading this chapter, and then we're going to break it down into its component parts. So 1 Corinthians chapter 13, I'll be reading out of the Scriptures version of the Bible. This is a translation from South America that contains the sacred names, in some Hebrew terminology. And so I begin in chapter 12 of the last verse, but earnestly seek the better gifts, and yet I show you a more excellent way. If I speak with the tongues of men and of messengers, but do not have love, I have become as sounding brass or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophecy and know all secrets and all knowledge, and if I have all belief so as to remove mountains, but do not have love, I am none at all. And if I give out all my possessions to feed the poor, and if I give my body to be burned, but do not have love, I have not profited at all. Love is patient, is kind. Love does not envy. Love does not boast, is not puffed up, does not behave indecently, does not seek its own, is not provoked, reckons not the evil, does not rejoice over the unrighteousness, but rejoices in the truth. It covers all, believes all, expects all, endures all. Love never fails. And whether there be prophecies, they shall be inactive, or tongues, they shall cease, or knowledge, it shall be inactive. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when that which is perfect has come, then that which is in part shall be inactive. When I was a child, I spoke as a child, I thought as a child, I reasoned as a child. But when I became a man, I did away with childish matters. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know, as I also have been known. And now belief, expectation, and love remain, these three. But the greatest of these is love. And I'm sure that this passage of Scripture you've heard many times preached in the places you came from, and you've read many times. And so it benefits us to go over the Scripture again, kind of carrying with us the backdrop of the Torah and the prophets and the example of the Messiah. And when we bring all that into view, as well as a couple of the word studies I'm going to do here today, I think we get a greater understanding of what love's all about, how love expresses itself. And so let's break forward into this teaching. Last week we were talking about spiritual gifts, and we went through a number of the spiritual gifts to describe how Elohim uses those in the body. He uses the giftings, he uses opportunities. The gifts are expressed in many different variety of ways. But Paul is going to talk about here is that with all these gifts that each one of us have been given, we can exercise these gifts for the benefit of the body. And I think to kind of summarize what I'm about to teach is that if we don't have love to cover all of those gifts that we're using, in other words, we can use our gifts, but if we're not expressing the gifts, if we're not encouraging, if we're not uplifting, if we're not rebuking in love, then it's not going to profit. It's not going to carry the results that it's intended to carry. So whenever it is that we exercise our gifts, however we do it, wherever we do it, and with whomever we share the things that we have with others, it has to be done in love, or it can fall to the ground. And that doesn't seem feasible or possible with the giftings that Elohim has given us. But if we're using our gifts to pound somebody with a hammer, to beat truth into them as we see it, then it's not going to be well received, it's going to be forgotten, and it's not going to be fruitful. So Paul says in the last verse in chapter 12, 1 Corinthians chapter 12, he says, but earnestly desire the greater gifts. He had gone through all the gifts. Well, not all of them, a number of them. He says, desire the greater gifts. And this word, earnestly desire, it kind of means to have a zeal for something. We sing songs and we read scriptures in the Old Testament about the zeal of Yahweh accomplishing something. He has a great striving or a great desire to express something. And we say he was zealous to do this thing. He's zealous over Zion, or he's zealous to save his people. And this is the same word, although in Greek, of that same concept of having a jealousy, a zealousy, a great longing or desire to see something come to pass. So we're to desire in that way, with a great desire, with an intense desire, the greater gifts. We're encouraged to do so. Those greater gifts are for the building up of the body. And yet, he says, and yet I show you a more excellent way. And so this is where he breaks into this discourse on love, because all of those gifts, even the great gifts that we have and exercise among one another, have to be done in a way that it can be received, and has to be done in a way that where people can see that it really is from Elohim. Because we can do things and say things and people will question, well, is that what God is really telling me? But if we do it in love, then that love covers over any doubt that people may have as to the source of this teaching of truth that we're trying to bring. So this is the more excellent way, is to do it, not just to carry it out, not to put it into practice, these various gifts that we have, but to do it in love. And when we do it in love, that's a better way to do it than to do it out of jealousy or pride, or trying to put somebody down, or any other possible motivation that we might have to give somebody a word. And hopefully, the word that we give is given out of a motivation of love and of seeing that person built up. But that's not always so, because we're human beings. Our flesh sometimes can fool us when we're exercising our gifts. We may be using that as a platform to talk down on somebody, or to put somebody down, or to criticize. And so that's where we need to be careful about how we exercise those gifts. The more excellent way is in love. So in chapter 14, verse 1, after the end of this chapter, Paul reiterates what he's saying here. He says, pursue love, and yet desire earnestly the spiritual gifts. And that's the same word that I talked about, showing zeal for, having a great striving to accomplish something. Earnestly desire the spiritual gifts. So if I speak with the tongue of men and angels, Paul says, but do not have love, I've become a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. I don't know if any of you remember the Gong Show.
Yep.
so many years ago.
Yeah, I do.
You know, when somebody came on and the performance wasn't really up to par, the guy would hit it's a great big gong. He would hit the gong, and that was to say, sorry, you're out of here. We reject it. So that's kind of like what our spiritual gifts being exercised can be like. It can be like a gong in somebody's ear if we don't bring it with the right motive and with the right attitude. We can be rejected just as those performers were rejected on that show. Or a clanging cymbal, kind of like the same thing. How's it possible to speak in tongues but not have love? Is that possible, to speak in tongues and not have love?
Yes.
I think so, otherwise Paul wouldn't be saying this. Mm-hmm. It's possible to be exercising these gifts, even the ones that we consider to be the greater gifts, prophecy, love, speaking in tongues, interpretation of tongues, healings, and all those kind of things. They can be exercised. We saw that Pharaoh's officials, when Moshe performed his first miracles that were from Elohim, the Pharaoh's officials were also able to duplicate those miracles. So even the pagans, those who worship other gods, can exercise certain types of gifts that are intended to be spiritual, intended to be used for good. But they can do them too. Our enemy is a counterfeiter. And so we need to be careful as we're exercising our gifts that we're not doing it in a counterfeit way or for motives that aren't out of pure love.
Hallelujah.
So it is possible to speak with tongues of men and of angels. So that's why we need to have love, otherwise we'll be gonged off the show.
Yep.
Verse 2, if I have the gift of prophecy and know all mysteries and all knowledge, I mean, that's a great thing to have that insight into the mysteries and all knowledge. And I believe that we can have a knowledge of the mysteries and all knowledge of Elohim, because that's what the word was given for. It was given for our instruction. It was given often in the first person from Elohim. Elohim spoke this and he spoke that, and we see that all throughout the Torah and the prophets and the writings. It's the Holy Spirit speaking. It's Elohim speaking, and we gain a knowledge of him from the words that he spoke. We get insights into his character and into his attributes, into how he reacts to certain situations, and how he is just and fair and kind and gracious, and all those attributes of Elohim are revealed in the scriptures, and so we gain a knowledge of who he is and what he's expecting of us through the word. And so we can know all knowledge and have a knowledge of mysteries. Paul revealed some of the mysteries, some of the things that weren't fully revealed in the Old Testament by the prophets, but Paul reveals some of those things in his letters. And it makes perfect sense that the seed that was promised to Abraham was talking about the Messiah, who would bring about the blessing of forgiveness of sins by his death on the tree, who would bring about an inheritance in the land, who would bring about all the promises that were made, that those that bless Abraham will. How does that go? That he will bless all nations, and whoever he blesses. How does that go? And whoever curses him will be cursed.
Bless those who bless you.
Bless those. Thank you. Bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. That's a mystery. We didn't understand how that was going to play out in history, but it turns out, mystery revealed is that it was through the Messiah that we are blessed, because we're blessing Elohim, and so we're blessed. We're blessing those people who come to Elohim and who walk in the truth, and therefore we are blessed. So we can have that information available and still not act in love. So, what then happens with our testimony? The same as I just mentioned, is it's going to fall to the ground. Because, we can give people information, but if we're not showing love, and that love expressing in a way that meets people's needs, and this is why Yeshua the Messiah performed healings, and he fed people. He gave them something physical and tangible so that they would hear the message that he had for them. And that's what the apostles did as well. So in other words, there has to be a practical expression of the love of Messiah in order for people to be able to receive our message of truth. Again, as we testify to others, we need to bring that. That needs to be on the table so that they can see what Jane mentioned this just a little bit ago, that they will know that we are his true disciples by our love for one another. And so it's by the love. It's not just by our actions, it's not just in exercising these gifts that they know that we're from him, but it's by our love in accord with what we're bringing to them in terms of the gifts and information and tangible help to people, that they know that this is the true thing. So prophesying without love typically does not result in the expected end that we had hoped for, because we're not bringing love. So how about faith? He says, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains but do not have love, I am nothing. So I want to bring you back to what the Messiah talked about moving mountains. Two scriptures, Matthew 17:20. He said to them, and this was the occasion where the disciples came to him and said, why weren't we able to cast out that demon? And he said to them, because of the littleness of your faith. For truly I say to you, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible to you. And so it's the exercising of faith. In other words, a true, genuine belief that something that you say, something that Elohim has communicated to you is true and will happen. When we have that kind of faith to believe that what we pronounce with our lips is going to happen. Not just that we hope that it will happen, or that that we want to see happen, but if we really believe that it will happen. Because that's what the apostles believed. When they spoke to the man as they were entering the temple, the man that was lame, and they spoke to him and they said, get up. I don't have silver or gold. Get up. You are healed in the name of Yahushua Messiah. And they believed it to be so. And it says, I think it was Peter that reached out his hand and helped the man up, and he stood up and he walked. Because Peter believed that when he spoke that to the man, it was going to happen. If we have that kind of faith, then we can move mountains, literally. Again, in Matthew 21 through 22, it says, Yahushua answered and said to them, truly I say to you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you will not only do what was done to the fig tree, but even if you say to this mountain, be taken up and cast into the sea, it will happen. And all things you ask in prayer, believing, you will receive. And so that's the great faith that Paul is talking about here. Even if we have that kind of faith, but we don't do it in love, it's going to fall to the ground. Because it doesn't accomplish, it doesn't convince, it doesn't help people to put their faith in Elohim. It could, they can, and you've heard this, people excuse the miracles that Father brings as something, well, that was a coincidence, or that was just a natural act of the creation of nature. That was just supposed to happen because it happened. But people, unless we bring love to the table, people will attribute the good works that we do to some other source. The enemy, to natural causes, or whatever. and they won't see God's hand in on it. And so this is the believing faith, that if we have this kind of believing faith that we're trusting and believing that it is going to happen, and even if it does happen, if we don't have love, it's still not going to accomplish what love is supposed to accomplish. So moving on, and we'll take questions and comments at the end of the teaching. And so write down, if you tend to forget, write down any questions you might have along the way. I'm gonna have plenty of time for everyone to speak. You know what comes to your mind and the things you want to share. Verse 3, 1 Corinthians 13:3. And if I give all my possessions to feed the poor, and if I surrender my body to be burned, but do not have love, it profits me nothing. So all of these things, he says, it doesn't benefit me, it doesn't profit me, it doesn't do any good, ultimately, if I don't do all of these things in love. So he says, if I give my possessions to feed the poor, and to feed the poor is actually, the poor is in parentheses here because it's not in the text. If I give all my possessions to feed, and I think back to Matthew 6:2, where Messiah is teaching his disciples, when you give to the poor, and that's a different word here, but it's talking about taking care of the needs of the poor. When you give to the poor, don't announce it on the housetops. Do it secretly. Even your right hand and the left hand don't know what they're doing. So it's kind of a secret thing that you're helping the poor, and it's not supposed to be something that we do in order for people to look at us as something important. And that was the point of several of the stories he told here in the Sermon on the Mount, is that we're not doing it for our own glory, but we're doing it out of pure motives to actually help somebody. And so when you give to the poor, if I give all my possessions to feed the poor, but have not love, it profits me nothing. If I surrender my body to be burned, and so there's a textual difference in the Greek. The scholars aren't sure, because different manuscripts sometimes read a little bit differently. The Greek manuscripts have two possible readings here, and it's all based on one letter change in the Greek. In some Greek manuscripts it says kalkasamai, and in others it says kalfasamai. The difference there in that one Greek letter is that kalkasamai means to boast. It means to boast. So that would read this way: if I surrender my body in order that I may boast. And it doesn't seem like it really fits the context, because he's talking about love as not being envious and boastful, and he lists another group of attributes that don't go along with the idea of boasting. But kalfasamai means to be burned, and that's a real possibility, because he's talking about extreme situations here, right? He's talking about giving all my possessions to the poor. I surrender my body to be burned. And so this idea of surrendering his body means the ultimate sacrifice. He gives his body on behalf of the gospel to be burned by the pagans who are hating on him. And so it seems that the second of the two is probably the more likely original reading, that if I give my body to be burned. So even so, if we go to that extreme, and we're willing to sacrifice ourselves and our own interests, but do not have love, then it doesn't profit anything. So let's look at what love is and what love is not, because the next 4 or 5 verses is all about love. It's giving adjectives or attributes, descriptions of what love looks like and what love does not look like. So he says love is patient, and patient has the idea of waiting for something. The element of expectation is kind of bound up in that word patience. And Richard, you said something in your prayer about waiting for something. What was it that you said in your prayer?
Expectantly?
Yeah, expectantly. I think of Noah. I mean, all of the patriarchs had to wait for the promises to be accomplished. Well, Abraham had to wait for something like 25 years before the son that was promised to him was born. Noah had to wait 120 years before the flood came. And we see throughout the history of Yah's people that people had to wait patiently for the fulfillment of what the Father had promised. And so this is an expression of love, is to be willing to wait patiently for that thing that's been promised. We can get all upset about, well, didn't God say this in His Word? And so I should be seeing this right now, right? I mean, shouldn't I be seeing this right now? And yet we're leaving out an element of, okay, He is going to fulfill it just as He promised, but it's not always when we expect it to be fulfilled.
That's true.
So we have to wait patiently for those things, and this is an expression of biblical love, the kind of love that we're encouraged to have. Love is patient. We wait for those things, even when it takes a while before we see those things fulfilled. Love is kind. Kind means to be gentle or to behave kindly. I always talk about this. When we witness to people, we need to be gentle with them. We can't hammer home the truth as though, they're going to be all ears and all eyes and just do whatever it is we say because we say it. Love is kind if we express the truth, the things that are harder for people to receive because they've been taught all the lies, all of their lies, in those other places of worship. If we deliver a kind word, a gentle word to them, like I was saying about the Sabbath, bring a positive tone to your discussion about the Sabbath and be gentle about it. Oh, Elohim is doing this to favor us. He wants to bless us. He wants to do good to us. That's why He's given us the Sabbath. It wasn't just to hold us back or to keep us from doing something we wanted to do. So when we bring a gentle tone to our witness, then the love that's found in the tone we bring and the attitude we bring will see to the fulfillment of what we're trying to accomplish in witnessing to them. Love is not. Now, those are two positive things. Love is patient, love is kind. Now he mentions in the negative what love is not. Love is not jealous. This word is used in a bad sense of hostile emotion based on resentment, jealousy. I know there's a difference between jealousy and zealousness. Even though it's the same Hebrew word, and I believe it's the same Greek word, it's the way that we present it. We can be zealous about something good, or we can be zealous about something bad. And that's why it's the same word. We can bring about a jealousy or a zealousness of hostility in one case, or we can bring the zeal of Yah in another case, expressing that deep desire to see Father's will being done in a positive light. And so envy is another word here. Jealousy or envy is the negative or hostile emotion that we can sometimes bring about. So love is not that. Love is not envious. It's not bringing a hostility to the table. Love does not brag. Bragging is boasting or behaving as a braggart or a windbag. This wasn't my word. This was.
That's a unique word. I heard that in a while.
Yeah, windbag.
That's an old term.
It is.
Ten Commandments.
Windbag.
Windbag. Braggart. So in other words, this love, it doesn't express itself by us trying to lift ourselves up by whatever it is we're bringing. Whatever truth, whatever opinion. It's not a windbag. It's not just about bragging about something I did or boasting in something I did, but it's about seeing the really basis of that exhortation with love to the table, so that I'm not exalted by it, but that Elohim is exalted. And love is not arrogant. It's not puffed up, blown up, or haughty or conceited. Again, these are all characteristics of somebody who's trying to lift themselves up. And it's easy for us to do that. It's easy for us to try to make ourselves look good in what we bring. And instead of that being the motive, instead of it not being about us, it truly is about Elohim and Elohim's kindness and Elohim's graciousness. But it's not about anything. We're just messengers. We're just servants. And that's we need to maintain that thought and that attitude when we're expressing the gospel to others. Love is patient. And this was the first one. Just wanted to bring a couple of verses about this attribute. Love is patient. In Luke 18:7-8, it says, "Now will not Elohim bring about justice for his elect who cry to him day and night, and will he delay long over them?" This is when, the parable of the guy who comes to his neighbor's door and says, help me out here. Somebody came in late at night. I need some food. And so it's on account of the fact that he's going to continue to pound on his door that the man inside's going to be like, all right, I'll give you some food. I'm a little bit inconvenienced here, but I'm going to give it to you, or otherwise you're going to keep pounding on my door and keeping me awake. And so love is the opposite of that. Elohim, the point of the story is that when somebody cries out to Elohim day and night, he's not going to delay long over them. He's not going to patiently wait out before he's going to fulfill our cries. He's going to do it quickly, he says in this parable. He's going to accomplish those things quickly because we're crying out. And so, although Elohim is patient toward us, not wanting any to perish, but all to come to repentance, Peter says, he's going to, in some cases when we cry out to him, he's not going to be patient to answer that prayer. He's going to answer quickly. So love as an attribute needs to be patient. We need to wait out the timing of Elohim. In James 5:7-8, therefore be patient, he says, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. Because this is another thing that we find it difficult to be patient about is, when's that coming? The skeptics are going to say, where's this coming that he talked about? It's been, what now? Almost 2,000 years since he promised that. So where is it? But we need to be patient. The farmer waits for the precious produce of the soil, being patient about it until it gets the early and late rains. And you too be patient. Strengthen your hearts, for the coming of the Lord is near. And so love is expressed through patience and waiting out Elohim. Love does not act unbecomingly. This is verse 5. And unbecomingly means defying moral standards or behaving improperly. Love does not act unbecomingly. Paul, earlier in this letter of 1 Corinthians, addressed the assembly at Corinth about this man who was acting improperly and defying moral standards when he took his father's wife to be his own. And so this whole love chapter, Paul is kind of reiterating some of the lessons that he was teaching earlier in the letter, where he was addressing a number of different issues that the Corinthians were struggling over. The difference between wisdom and power and the cross, and their questions about marriage, their questions about head coverings, their questions, all kinds of different questions that they had because they didn't understand how to walk those things out. And so this whole love chapter is Paul reiterating the attributes of love so that when future situations came up that they were uncertain about, at least they would act in love. And they would not behave or not allow people to behave improperly or immorally. So love does not act unbecomingly or immorally. It does not seek things of itself. In other words, its own interests. And I have another scripture on that from Philippians 2. Love does not seek its own. Do nothing from selfishness or empty conceit. but with humility of mind regard one another as more important than yourselves. Do not merely look out for your own personal interests, but also for the interests of others. And this is how love expresses itself, by not seeking out the things that are beneficial to me only, in my own interests. But it's love acts in the interests of others. And that's how we express love, by putting other people ahead of our own interests. Love is not provoked. This word literally means to sharpen. It's not sharpen. It's not aroused or irritated in a negative sense, upset by, stimulated to some wrong end. It's not provoked. Love doesn't. We can't provoke people into believing the message of the word.
Hallelujah.
We can't provoke them. We have to present it gently. And so love isn't going to take that route in our witnessing. We're not going to try to provoke others, even though we think, well, maybe we can compel them. No, we can't compel people. It's the Spirit that compels people.
Hallelujah.
And so provoking does nothing but bad in terms of the end result of our testimony. It does not take into account a wrong. It doesn't take into account a wrong. The words used here, the word take into account means literally to count or to calculate. It's a process of the mind whereby we're reasoning what the result should be. And when we take into account, what we're doing is, and it's the wrong here is the Greek word for evil. It doesn't take into account, or it doesn't hold on account an evil done. In other words, we're not holding against somebody a wrong that they did to us. It says love your enemy. Your enemy does things that are wrong toward you, but we don't hold that on our account as we're talking to them about the good news. We can't do that, or otherwise it's gonna take on that negative connotation and ultimately be rejected. So these are things that love is not unbecoming, not seeking its own. It's not provoked, and it doesn't hold on to or calculate or keep a record of wrongs done against us. That's hard. I mean, each one of these things is hard for us as human beings, because we remember things that people said to us or things that people did to us, and yet when we're acting in love, we have to let those things go. We have to forgive those things, and forgive means literally to let go of something. We can't hold on to those things in our minds and let those things aggravate us, affecting our witness toward others and our behavior toward others. Love does not take into account a wrong. Zechariah 8:17, also let none of you devise evil in your heart against another, and do not love perjury, for all these are what I hate, declares Yahweh. And so devising evil in your heart, we're gonna look at 2 slides on the Torah about love. And this is one of the things that the Torah says about love, is it's not devising evil or holding something against a brother. And that's what it means to take into account a wrong. It's holding something against your brother, whereby you're not going to do good by your brother. It doesn't calculate evil, is what I said the literal Greek text reads. It doesn't calculate evil. Love does not rejoice in unrighteousness, but rejoices with the truth. We read in other passages of Scripture that we're to have a love for the truth. We had a little discussion this week about it, about having a love for the truth, and that's found in 2 Thessalonians 2. But also in Romans 1:32, it says, although they know, it's speaking about people that are walking in these wicked things, exchanging the use of their bodies for that which is wrong, other sexual choices, I guess you could put it that way. He says, although they know, the ordinance of Elohim, that those who practice such things are worthy of death, they not only do the same, but also give hearty approval to those who practice them. And that's what it means that we don't rejoice in unrighteousness. We can't approve of evil being done in our midst. It has to be confronted and rebuked. And so the wicked people do that. The wicked try to gather to themselves people of the same opinion, that we can be sexual deviants, or we can be idolaters, or any of the other evils that people do. We can do that, you know, and it's helpful to us if the people around us are doing it too. So we can all do it together, and we can all just be happy about it and feel comfortable in this atmosphere of living among people who approve of such things. But love does not rejoice in unrighteousness. It only rejoices with the truth. So that's why we need to be speakers of the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. So here's some positives. We ran through a bunch of negatives of what love is not. Here's some positive things. It bears all things. In other words, it keeps silent about wrongs done. It keeps a confidential record of, you know, what if I was wronged? I'm not going to, you know, tell everyone else that so-and-so wronged me. It bears all things. I'm going to hold it to myself and not spread this report about somebody to others and try to get other people to hate on him too. Even though, you know, I'm not supposed to hate on him. But if I share the negatives about somebody to others, they're gonna develop a hatred toward that person, or some sort of negative response to that person. Love bears all things. It holds it in. It believes all things. Having confidence in the things that have been spoken. It hopes all things. In other words, having a great expectation of all things, and endures all things. It's patient. It puts up with all things. In other words, love isn't something that is based upon our circumstance or our interactions with other people, but love has to come from a higher source. We can't react to what people say and do to us and still be bearing love toward them. And that's what these things mean. Bearing, putting up with all things, having confidence in the Word, and enduring the things that evil people bring our way. So I want to just take a moment to look at love in the Torah, and then we're going to make a couple of quick comparisons between how Paul described love and how the Torah describes love. And this is taken from Leviticus 19. At the end of this passage, verses 11 through, I think, 18, the writer, Moses, is talking about love. He ends up by saying that famous statement, "But you shall love your neighbor as yourself." And so all of these things are expressions of love. He says, "You shall not steal, you shall not deal falsely, nor lie to one another. You shall not swear falsely by my name so as to profane the name of your Elohim. I am Yahweh." And swearing by Elohim, by the name falsely, it means to be speaking about somebody that's not true, something that's not true. So I'm swearing that so-and-so did or said some such thing, but it's not so. He didn't really say that, and so that would be a way of denigrating your brother, giving false testimony to your brother. And that's what the command to swear falsely about is all about. It's about when we speak of others. The primary meaning of that: do not lift up the name of Yahweh in vain or unto emptiness. Lifting up is an expression which means taking an oath or swearing, or giving a testimony that somebody said or did something. So the primary application of that commandment in the Decalogue is not to say what is false about your brother. And so here in Leviticus 19, "You shall not swear falsely by my name. And then verse 13, you shall not oppress your neighbor, nor rob him. The wages of a hired man are not to remain with you until night, all night until morning. And you shall not curse a deaf man, nor place a stumbling block before the blind. But you shall revere your Elohim. I am Yahweh. These are all expressions of love toward your neighbor. You don't do this, you don't do that. All expressed in a negative way. You don't curse a deaf man. You don't put a stumbling block before the blind man. You don't oppress. You don't rob. You don't swear falsely against your neighbor. You don't steal or lie. You do not. You shall not do. You shall not do injustice in judgment. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, but you are to judge your neighbor fairly. You shall not, listen to all the shall nots. You shall not go about as a slanderer among your people. You are not to act against the life of your neighbor. I am Yahweh. You shall not hate your fellow countrymen in your heart. You may surely reprove your neighbor, but you shall not incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance nor bear any grudge against the sons of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So what do we see in these instructions about the expression of love? These are all expressed in the negative, and so the difference between love as expressed here in Leviticus 19 and the love that Paul's talking about in 1 Corinthians 13 are several. In the one, there's do's and don'ts, particularly don'ts. Don't do this. If you're loving your neighbor, you don't do this. If you're loving your neighbor, you don't do that. In Paul, he's expressing a mindset of do's and don'ts. He's expressing what love looks like, and then also what love doesn't look like through the attributes of love. Whereas in the Torah expresses love by giving simple examples of our behavior as to what is love and as to what love is not. And so really Paul's saying the same things, but he's expressing love in a different way. He's expressing the attributes of love. The practical examples of actions in the Torah and the attitudes of behavior in Paul are really speaking to the very same issues, just being expressed in a different way. Negatively express what is and what is not. So really what I'm trying to get to here is that Paul's passage about love is really right in line with the Torah. Even though expressed in a different way, he's saying all the same things as the Torah is telling us love is. So he goes on to say, 1 Corinthians 13:8, love never fails or falls. That word literally means falls, but translated typically as fails in this context. It doesn't fail. But if there are gifts of prophecy, they will be done away. If there are tongues, they will cease. If there is knowledge, it will be done away. And I want to look at these words real quick. To be done away means to cause to be idle or useless. Kind of like in the same vein as people say that the Torah has been done away with. It's been abolished. It's no longer valid, which we know is not true. But this is the same word that's used. If there's prophecy, they will be done away with. What does he mean by that they're going to be done away with? Does it mean that that prophecy and tongues and knowledge are no longer available to us in the present age? Or does it mean something else? And of course I would say that they mean something else. Because he's going to describe in the next verse when these things will literally be done away with. They're not done away with now. Prophecy is still an important gift. In fact, it's next to love, it's probably the most important gift in the assembly. The ability to speak truth, to speak the word as Elohim has revealed it. That's prophecy. Whether it's present, speaking of the present, or speaking of the future, it's all prophecy. It's all speaking forth the word that Elohim has revealed. That's going to be done away with someday. Tongues will cease. They will stop at some point in time. But when will these gifts be done away with. And Paul addresses that in the next couple of verses. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will be done away. So here he's revealing when prophecy and tongues are going to be no longer needed and no longer used in the assembly, and it's when the perfect comes. What is the perfect? Well, the perfect is that time when the Messiah returns.
The perfect one.
That's, the things that are done in part are being done now, in the meantime, until the time of Messiah. And verse 11 expresses that very interpretation. He says, when the perfect comes, the partial will be done away with. Teleios is the word perfect there. We've talked about this word before. I don't know if you remember it. It means to be completed, with its chief component as totality as opposed to partial or limited. A thing in full measure, undivided, complete, or entire. In other words, it's speaking of the return of the Messiah when what we have right now is going to be changed, and the Messiah is going to fulfill all of those things. And it even speaks of our own body as being perfect, the resurrection body. So what is the perfect? It's the coming of the Messiah. It's the kingdom of Elohim on earth. It's the resurrection. It's the state of perfection. And all of those things come at the same time. When the Messiah returns, those are the things that are going to be accomplished. That state of perfection is going to be achieved by each one of us when we receive a resurrection and a new body. And so that's when all of these other things that were given in part are going to be done away with. But not until then, because we need all those gifts in the body today. We need prophecy most of all. We need tongues, revelation that Elohim gives to people, and then we need to know what that means, the interpretation of tongues. And we need the other gifts, the gifts of administration and of helps and of teaching and all the things we talked about last week. Each one of those gifts is needed in the assembly, and that's why we need to gather together, is so that we can encourage one another, and so that the body, when it's in operation, has all of its parts. When our own bodies don't have feet, we're in a wheelchair, right? And you can go down the list. If we don't have ears, we need somebody to assign to us, and so forth and so on. So we need all of the parts of the body, and all the gifts are expressions of the things that Elohim is showing us and revealing to us. And so when that perfect thing comes, then that which is partial or meant to be in part will be done away with. Literally no longer needed and discarded. Because I don't think in the kingdom, what does it say? At that time you will no longer say to one another, "Know Yahweh," for you will all know me, from the least to the greatest. So we're not going to need somebody to reveal truth to us anymore. We're going to have it right before our eyes. We're going to understand it in that time of perfection. Paul uses this analogy of a child and an adult. When I was a child, I used to speak like a child. I was thinking like a child. I was reasoning like a child. And here, just on the side, in the Greek language, there are various tenses: past, present, future, perfect, and there are several other tenses. One of those tenses is a past tense that is looked upon as something that was ongoing. And it's not used very often, but it's used here in this verse, where I translated it, I was thinking like a child. It's a past tense, but seen as happening over the course of time. I was speaking like a child when I was a child. I was thinking like a child. I was reasoning like a child. In other words, this was a way of life for me. When I was a child, I did those childish things. I didn't have a full understanding, but when I became a man, I did away with childish things. And this did away with is the same one we saw where it said that prophecies will be done away with. I did away with, I no longer had need of childish things. Those young in the faith cannot always see the whole picture. As a result of people growing in the Lord and not having the full picture, seeing, the whole forest as well as seeing the individual trees, people complain and they balk at what the Father's telling them to do. They resist His will and they question Elohim. Why are you bringing me through this? Why do I have to do that? Why do I have to keep the Sabbath day? And so we complain and we question and we resist the Holy Spirit because we don't see the whole picture. And that's what it's like when we're growing up. We don't see the whole picture. Thus the analogy here. As we're growing up in Messiah, we don't see the whole picture, and so we have a tendency, almost a desire to question everything that Elohim has told us to do. But as we grow in the faith, and we get beyond that, and we just receive the things that the Father gives, knowing that there always is a purpose in those things. So now we see in a mirror dimly, Paul says, but then face to face. Again, this is referring to when perfection comes. And the face-to-face expression is clearly a reference to when we're going to see Messiah, eyeball to eyeball. We're going to see Him in His coming. He's no longer going to be somebody who's up in heaven, who's interceding, and who did all these great works for us to provide us redemption and forgiveness of sins. But we're going to see Him as He truly is. Now I know in part, but then I will know fully, just as I have been fully known. The mirror here is actually a piece of flat metal, because they didn't have glass mirrors in those days. It's translated mirror because that's, in our language and culture, that's what it amounts to. It's a flat piece of metal that shines, by which we can see a reflection. You can do that in still water as well. You can see your reflection dimly. But this particular word is referring to a flat piece of metal, and the word dimly is the same word as enigma, interestingly enough. It's the Greek word, literally enigma, as a saying difficult to understand, a riddle or an enigma. It's like a parable. It's something that we see, we kind of get the picture of. It's a picture of something, but it's not on full display, completely obvious to us. We're looking at it and we're trying to figure out, well, this parable, this analogy, what is this really saying about this particular teaching that is being described through the parable or enigma? It's seeing something darkly, as a revelation obscurely expressed dimly or indistinctly. And so we see now, in part, because we don't see the full picture. Even now, we're mature adults, we still don't see the full picture of what we need to see and what we will someday see. We're still looking at a kind of a dull representation of what is to come. And so at that time, we're going to see Him face to face. And so Paul finishes, and I'm near finishing too. Now abide faith, hope, and love, these three, but the greatest of these is love. Love is a blanket that covers over and rules over all the other gifts. And I hope that's something that you can take from this teaching, is that the other gifts are all needed and necessary, but love has to be above them all, and we have to exercise these gifts in love. The gifts can be ineffective if they are not exercised with love. And so here's my summary and practical application. Our witnessing must be done with genuine love, not as a means of putting notches on our belts. And people want to count how many people they got saved that day. And they put little notches on their belt, or football players put little stars on their helmets for their tackles or their great plays or whatever. And everyone has to kind of wants to brag about their accomplishments, but it should not be about that for us. It's not about our bragging that we got 2 people saved today, or we talked 10 people into saying the Lord's Prayer, or 100 or 1,000 or whatever. I mean, all of that is good and well, but it's not bragging rights of ours, and it's not being done so that we can brag on ourselves and we can lift ourselves up. Ministering will be less effective, even ineffective, if not done with love. What then is love? And here's my final statement. Love is letting Elohim's instructions guide our thoughts, words, and actions to the benefit of our fellow human being. Love is treating others with the respect and dignity that Elohim has treated us with. And so, if we're truly expressing love in the application of our gifts, then we are respecting and loving, speaking gently to, in a way that can be received by the love of Messiah. And that love needs to manifest in the way that we share the gospel. So that's what I have today on love. 1 Corinthians chapter 13. I know I left a lot out. There's a lot more to say. So what are your thoughts and impressions about the things we spoke of today?